The opioid epidemic, man. I mean, this is why we have to legalize all drugs. Like, we have to legalize and regulate all drugs for a couple reasons. One is it literally makes things safer. Two, it's not criminalizing behavior because addiction becomes so much bigger than your first couple uses of a drug. Excuse me. It's just like addiction is one of those things where once you're in it, it's very difficult to break free of it. And if it's criminalized, that means that you don't even have like the best access to deal with those things. Not to mention rehab is extremely expensive. And because we don't have healthcare here in America, you don't have any real ways to like take care of it unless you have a lot of money to throw into rehab. And so that's where, you know, there's a failure of the healthcare system that plays a huge part in this. On top of the fact that big pharmaceuticals got into selling these drugs in the first place, because the opioid epidemic was created from the legal prescriptions that were being overprescribed or prescribed by some dirty doctors, these pill mills in these different states, where they were literally ordering more pills than people by like a lot. So it's a really multifaceted issue that stems from big pharma ultimately trying to push things that they pretended were not addictive, but they were. They literally said the oxycodone was, oh yeah, it's like heroin, but not addictive. Fucking, as we all know now, it's clearly very addictive. And the whole thing is frustrating because those people should be in jail, literally. I think we should jail every single one of the executives that knew what they were doing and that were selling these horrible drugs that got people hooked from the simplest things. Like, doctors were telling people like, oh yeah, it's not a big deal. Like, it's fine to just take these, for pain management. And then people would get hooked on them, not even realizing that it was so addictive. And then you're creating addicts out of people who otherwise never would have just done heroin. But then once you get hooked on these things, it hijacks your reward system. It changes your brain in a way that, you need the fix. And what's frustrating about it is that once they were no longer able to do the pill mills, which is a good thing, I'm glad that they stopped that, we didn't do anything for the people who got addicted to these things. We didn't give them ways to deal with it because, it's illegal. And so then they would go to heroin because heroin was way cheaper. And eventually it got to the point where, a lot of people were doing heroin on the streets because they couldn't get those pills anymore. And then that's when fentanyl came in. And fentanyl started showing up as this like way more potent version of heroin. And by the way, there are like way better people to get this information from. But I'm giving you a summary of it because I think it's all directly related to how Mac died. Because he literally died partially because he had fentanyl in his system. He also had alcohol and cocaine. So, just a deadly combination of drugs in general. But still, I think he probably wouldn't have overdosed if it weren't for the fentanyl. The fentanyl, I think, is what set him overboard. And this is all stemming from a legal system that created this crisis. And then we shifted to illegal versions of these things, which are not regulated and have been cut with some bullshit. And then we jail people when we find them with it, And that's the part where it's like the whole war on drugs has obviously been a failure. No one's doing less drugs. This hasn't changed, what people are doing. And that's because this war on drugs was never about the health part. It was never about, it's a loving government that wants to make sure that we take care of our citizens. Like, no, that's not what this is. This was literally meant to demonize certain populations of America, which then we used our power to push it against the world. But it was meant to disenfranchise black people. It was meant to disenfranchise the hippies, the sweeping psychedelic act, in accordance with everything else that they made illegal, was meant to demonize these communities on the news every day. And literally there's Nixon's administrator, one of his administrators, was quoted saying that like we couldn't make it illegal to be black or against the war, but we could make it illegal, for these things that are associated with these communities, and then we could demonize them on the news every day. Yeah, we knew what we were doing. Like, literally, I mean, find the quote. Maybe I'll link it in the description, but it's horrifying what he said. And the fact that we still have these laws despite all the evidence and all the science, and then you have all these politicians that gaslight you and say like, oh yeah, well, we need to study it more. Well, okay, but because of your scheduling, it's like fucking so hard to get any funding or anything for these studies. And even Joe Biden, this motherfucker's still against the legalization of weed. What? How are you against the legalization of weed? Are you fucking stupid? Like, that's such a dumb position to have if you're on the left. And that's why when AOC said that, you know, if we were in another country, we wouldn't even be in the same party. That's the truth. It's because, like she said, there is no left party in America. And it's true. There's no left party in America. We have a far right party, the Republican Party, which is, Jesus Christ, they've gone off the rails in the last several years. And then we have the center party. And the center party never wants to upset power, never wants to upset the money interest, but is willing to throw some social bones. Oh, yeah, you know, gay marriage. Okay, fine. You know, yeah, okay. You know, I can't even think of other policies, honestly, because they don't stand for any. You know, that's the frustrating part, is like they really don't stand for anything. And guess what? Anytime they talk about bipartisan effort, it means bipartisan to help the establishment. It's never bipartisan to help people, because the Republicans will never give you that. So the left has to exist in this small little faction that doesn't actually hold any power and barely can even get the Democratic Party to support their ideas. I mean, and even when they do, they like pretend to, but then they don't really, and they don't follow through, and then they don't even try to appease the voters in any meaningful way. So it's very frustrating when we have systems like this that are so obvious, like the drug war, that we then do nothing about, because the people who are on the left aren't even fighting hard enough to stop these things. And guess what? You know how you beat the cartel? You legalize the shit and you take away their profit. You're not going to beat them in a war, like a physical war with guns. That's not helping anyone except the military-industrial complex. Oh, that's why. It's because it's always to fund the military-industrial complex. They want to sell more guns. They want to sell more weapons. And they don't care who they're selling them to. Because, you know, we'll have battles where we're fighting with our weapons against other people fighting with our weapons. It's like I just watched The Last Jedi recently with my girlfriend. And in that, you know, there's the scene on Canto Bight, the casino planet. And they talk about like how, oh, they're selling to the First Order. And then the fucking, I can't remember his name, dude. People are going to be so mad at me for not remembering some of these. He's a super famous actor. But he's the dude with like the stutter. And he talks about how it's like, hey, they sell to both teams. You know, there are no good guys or bad guys. You know, everything's kind of a gray area. Well, that's exactly what it's like here in America too. You know, we fund fucking horrible people that fight against other horrible people all the time. I mean, that's kind of part of our foreign policy, is propping up little groups that, you know, we think have, they're like an enemy of my enemy is my friend type situation. And so, you know, you have things like the war on drugs, you have all these conflicts that we get in the Middle East, and there's no left party to stop any of it, which is so frustrating. And I get it. You know, there are going to be some people who listen to this podcast and they're not left-leaning. They don't support some of these ideas. I understand that. I disagree with you, but that's okay. You know, if you actually genuinely hold a view and you're going to be honest about it and you're not going to just scream like, oh, but Venezuela, you know, then fine. Then I think that we have a real, you know, debate that I think we can talk about the ideas. I personally think that, you know, progressives kind of win on the ideas, because if you actually look at the math and the science and everything, like you can kind of see where just certain policies, which by the way are not being advocated by the Democrats. So I am not defending the Democratic Party in any way. But those ideas, you know, they kind of win on the basis of common sense and logic and really studies of other countries doing it and implementing it successfully. Portugal decriminalized all drugs. And although that's not as good of a step as legalization, it's definitely better than, you know, the U.S.'s system. And it's worked really well. Overall drug use is down. The criminal activity around drugs is down. It's just, it makes it way better, because you're basically, decriminalization is not far enough to me, but if you legalize the drugs, you force it into a regulated market. Now, this doesn't mean you can just go down to Walgreens and just buy some cocaine. I think that's part of the regulation part, right? There are going to be certain aspects of, how can we prescribe these drugs? I'm okay with the idea of like heroin centers for people to get off of them, where we give them a safe place where if they want to do it, they have safe needles and all these other things that like we can wean people off of these drugs by giving them safe places for them to do them, to get their fix and to slowly wean off. And I think that should always be the goal embedded within those systems. And I think there's no reason why we couldn't publicly fund it, especially if we had something like Medicare for all, because then that would just be part of what we pay in our taxes. And so instead of paying out of pocket in these kind of scenarios, you pay a little bit more in taxes, but you save a lot more out of your pocket because you're not paying copays, you're not paying premiums, you're not paying deductibles. And so I think a combination of all of these things are going to be really important for transforming our horrible war on drugs and transforming really the negative cycles, or as I know Bernie likes to call it, like the diseases of despair, which I think is a really good way to describe it. Because a lot of the times that people get into these drugs, with the opioids, it's a little gray because part of it was like literally they might have had a surgery and then they got hooked on it from there. And that's just unfortunate. But there's a lot of people who get into some of these more hardcore drugs from problems, like, emotional problems, not being able to deal with them. And if we can't cover mental health, I feel like everybody should have a therapist. And I say this as somebody who, like, I don't have one, but I want to get one. Because I think that that's something that everybody should have. Everybody should have somebody that they can talk out their issues with, and somebody who's trained on this stuff and who knows how to deal with it, because not everybody's equipped to solve their own problems, at least not right away. I think you are eventually, and you can learn those skills, but you need to learn from somebody who knows what they're doing. And I think it's really important to factor in our mental health as part of our physical health. And they do feed back into one another. What you're eating also is going to help how you feel. So if you're eating good food, then you're going to feel better. And when you feel better, you're going to make better decisions. And it kind of is a positive feedback loop. And so I know that some people in this world or in America, some people are just dumb, right? And it's not a knock on them. I think they deserve life of dignity. I think they deserve to be able to have all the great things that other people have. But some people are just dumb and they just make bad decisions, and it just is what it is. And that's just how they are. But that doesn't mean that we can't create systems that make it easier for them to make better decisions. And I can understand people's pushback of not wanting to nerf the world, so to speak. And I'm not even proposing that, but I think, if you guys are familiar with bowling, I think it's okay to put the railings up for people who need them, because some people need railings. Other people can bowl and it's fine and they don't gutter all the time. But some people are just so bad at decision making that they gutter all the time. And I'd rather, instead of them guttering and creating a negative feedback loop and rippling all across a bunch of other people, because guess what? We don't live in a vacuum. We're interdependent. As much as people like to think that they're individuals and that they have this individual freedom, you don't. You're part of a system. And, you can move independently to a degree within the system, but you're ultimately relying upon everyone else. Everything that's in this room was made by somebody else that I don't fucking know, like with very few exceptions. And so that's the thing, like we rely on other people to create all of our stuff that is in our society. And so if we know that we have to rely on other people, and we know that we're interdependent, and we know that any decision that we make is going to affect another person, then shouldn't we have systems in place in our society that prevent people from making the really dumb decisions that really negatively impact all of us? I think so.